They told you Italy was one nation, one culture, one people under the sun. But when scientists peeled back the layers of the Italian genome, it shattered. Because Italy, the country, is a lie your DNA refuses to tell. The deeper researchers dug, the more contradictions they unearthed. Not cultural, biological. A man from Calabria, at the southern tip, is genetically closer to a Greek islander than to someone from Florence. Sardinians? They don't even belong to modern Europe. Their blood echoes voices from 8,000 years ago. Farmers who vanished everywhere else, but survived here. What you call Italian isn't one thing. It's many ghosts wearing the same skin. Zoom into the genome, and Italy unravels. North and South are so genetically different. They might as well be different countries. In fact, the genetic gap between Milan and Palermo is wider than between Madrid and Warsaw. And yet we speak of one Italy, one flag, one face. But how do you unite a country that was never one people? What happens when national pride meets ancestral chaos? Because this isn't just about blood. It's about identity. What if your surname says Roman, but your cells whisper Persian? What if your culture sings Dante, but your chromosomes chant Homer? If your passport says Italy, but your DNA tells a different story, who do you believe? Maybe Italy was never a country. Maybe it's something far stranger. A continent disguised as a nation. And to understand how that happened, to trace how so many ancient worlds became trapped inside a single peninsula, we have to go somewhere frozen. Not by snow, by time. An island where history refused to move forward. And where the oldest genes in Europe are still awake. Not all bloodlines move forward. While the rest of Italy was becoming a battlefield of identities, layered, rewired, rewritten, there was one place that stayed eerily still. Not by force, but by choice of geography. An island, adrift in the Mediterranean, where history knocked, and no one answered. Sardinia. Not the Sardinia of travel blogs, beaches and wine, but the Sardinia beneath your skin. Because when scientists cracked open the genomes of its people, they found something staggering. 62.5% of their DNA isn't Roman, or Greek, or anything modern. It comes from a vanished world, Anatolian farmers who crossed the sea 8,000 years ago, and then disappeared from nearly everywhere else. Everywhere except here. Other parts of Europe were swept clean, by nomads, by empires, by war. But Sardinia? Sardinia said no. It locked the door. And somehow that ancient blood survived. Still pulsing. Still present. Still whispering secrets from the Neolithic age. This isn't just old DNA. It's living memory, a fossil in human form. When the rest of Europe changed, adapted, forgot, Sardinia remembered. Its people carry the genes of the first farmers, not in fragments, but in full chorus. And yet, here's the twist. This island, frozen in time, is also one of the most genetically diverse places in Europe. How? How can a place so isolated, so untouched, contain so much variation? Is it the mountains? The coastline? Or something else? Because inside this contradiction lies a deeper truth, that you don't need war to shape DNA. You just need time. And silence. Stand in the neuralgic ruins of Baramini, under a sky that hasn't changed in millennia, and you'll feel it. Not history. Legacy. But Sardinia was never alone. While it kept its ancient soul hidden in stone, something else was happening across the sea. A different kind of survival. On the mainland, far from the island's silence, people were waking up under ice. Sardinia stood still. But on the mainland, time was breaking open. Not with empires, not with armies, but with something colder, wilder. An age where ice swallowed the earth. 19,000 years ago, Europe was silent, buried under walls of snow taller than cathedrals. And in this frozen world, Italy became something unexpected. A refuge. While the north was dying, Italy was breathing barely. Hidden in its caves, clinging to fire, were people who would never write books, never build cities, but whose blood still runs through millions. They didn't call themselves anything, but we call them the first Italians. Magdalenian, Epigrammatian, words we invented long after their voices were gone. They hunted with stone, painted with ash, loved, fought, grieved, under skies that had never seen a road. And their DNA, it didn't just survive. It became the spine of northern Italy's genome, a signature left by shadows, older than myth. But here's the twist. Even before farming, before language, before borders, Italy was already splitting. North and south, divided not by politics, but by glaciers and time. One line moved with the ice. The other stayed behind untouched, unmixed. You won't read this in a textbook. But inside your cells, the story is clear. Long before Italy had a name, its people were already walking two different paths. And they never knew. Every footstep in the snow, every birth by the fire, was setting the stage for a genetic divide that still exists today. Identity, forming in silence, under frost. But something was moving. From the east. Not warriors. Not kings. But farmers. And they weren't just bringing food. They didn't arrive with swords. No flags. No battles. No names in legend. Just baskets full of seeds. From the east, across the Aegean waters, they came quietly. But what they carried was world-altering. Because when the Neolithic farmers stepped onto Italian soil, they weren't just planting crops. They were planting new blood. The hunter-gatherers who had survived glaciers, hunted mammoths, painted dreams on cave walls. They didn't vanish all at once. But they were no match for what came next. The farmers brought wheat, barley, goats, fire pits, permanent homes, and something invisible. Genes. And those genes took root faster than any grain. Within a few generations, the map of Italian ancestry began to change. In some places, the old hunter lineages mixed, blended. In others, they disappeared completely. And this is where it gets personal. Because that dinner is on your plate, that pasta, that olive oil, that sense of home tied to a kitchen, it doesn't start with Rome. It starts with them. Anatolian farmers. 8,000 years ago. Long before Latin, long before the empire, long before the concept of Italian. These people were building stone houses, while the rest of Europe still lived in tents. They were the first to name land as theirs, to measure a season, to settle. And their DNA didn't just enter the bloodline. It rewired identity. In Sardinia, their genome remained almost untouched, locked in place, like a time capsule. On the mainland, it fused with the hunters, forming something new. The base layer of Italian ancestry. Quiet, permanent, unshakable. We call it heritage. But it started with survival. And yet, it wasn't the end. Because while these farmers were sowing roots, something else was stirring on the far horizon. Not gentle, not slow. A storm of hooves and iron. The farmers thought they had time. They built walls, measured seasons, passed land down like blood. But time was already galloping toward them. From the east, across the wide plains of the steppe, came men who didn't build fences. They built momentum. They rode with bronze blades, wheels that turned like fate, and a language no one had heard before. But everyone would one day speak. They didn't conquer by number, they conquered by speed. And when they reached Italy, something broke. Not the land, the lineage. Northern Italy opened first. The Y-DNA shifts sharply. A hard spike of steppe ancestry. Over 25% in some valleys. Not just genes. Ideas. Patriarchy. War. The cult of the father. Bloodlines carried in the male voice. And with them came the roots of Latin. The skeleton of the very language you're hearing now. But they didn't reach all of Italy equally. In the south, the imprint is faint. Almost like the hooves stopped echoing. And that's the twist. Because modern Italians aren't the pure children of Rome. They're the legacy of fusion. The Latin and Italic tribes? Not untouched natives. They were already hybrids, part Neolithic farmer, part Ice Age hunter, and now part rider. And embedded in that mix is conflict. Land versus motion. Hearth versus horse. The stillness of roots versus the hunger to move. That's not just history. That tension lives in the genome. In how we remember. In how we fight. In how we inherit. The farmers brought the future. But the riders brought the structure. They didn't plant crops. They planted systems. And while the ground was still trembling from their arrival, another migration was preparing to reshape everything again. But this one didn't come on horseback. It came on ships. And it never left. The horsemen changed the land. But the sea rewrote the soul. Because just as the steppe winds settled, sails began to appear on the southern horizon. Not warships, not yet. Trading vessels, colonist fleets. And on board were men who would carve temples into volcanic rock and leave their names in the bones of future generations. Greeks. They didn't come to conquer. They came to recreate. By the 8th century BCE, southern Italy wasn't just Italy anymore. It was Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities like Cyprus, Taranto, and Kymi weren't outposts. They were echoes. The architecture, the rituals, the language, even the olive trees, all pulled straight from the Aegean. And the DNA? It never left. Today, 37% of male Sicilian lineages still trace back to Greek founders. Not folklore. Blood. So imagine this. You're walking the streets of Palermo, eating street food under Roman arches. But your Y chromosome, it's Spartan. You argue in Italian, but your genome still speaks Homer. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about inheritance. Because in the South, the Greek influence didn't fade. It fermented. It turned into dialects that twist differently, dishes that taste older, faces that reflect another shore. Statues that once stood in Athens now stand in Naples, not as copies, but as continuations. Southern Italy didn't just absorb Greek culture. It became its heir. But nothing stays untouched forever. Just as these colonies began to bloom, just as temples rose and Greek bloodlines rooted deep into Italian soil, another power was rising. One that didn't trade. It was conquered. It didn't echo culture. It swallowed it whole. And from the center of the peninsula, beneath 7 hills, Rome began to move. Not with ships, but with legions. The Greeks brought ideas, but Rome brought gravity. Not the kind that pulls you down, the kind that pulls you in. Because once Rome began to rise, no culture around the Mediterranean stayed untouched, including its own. It claimed to unify, but inside its walls, something strange happened. It began to absorb, and as the empire expanded eastward, into the Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, and beyond, the bloodlines of the capital started to shift. At first, it was subtle, but then the cemeteries began to speak. Beneath the marble of imperial Rome, beneath the villas and aqueducts, scientists uncovered DNA that didn't match the story. The original italic lines, fading. In their place, Near Eastern ancestry, North African lineages, Eastern Mediterranean migrants, people pulled into the empire, as soldiers, as merchants, as slaves, as citizens. The irony, the more powerful Rome became, the less Roman its people looked. The heart of the empire, genetically, may have resembled modern Beirut more than modern Milan. And yet, no one questioned it, because identity wasn't in blood anymore. It was in belonging. You could be Syrian, Anatolian, Berber, but once you walked through the gates of Rome, you were something else. You were Roman. It was a new kind of empire, one that rewrote not just borders, but blood. And inside that rewriting, something beautiful and terrifying was born. An identity powerful enough to erase ancestry. But identity doesn't hold forever. Not when the legions weaken. Not when the borders crumble. Because while Rome was changing from within, something colder was gathering beyond its walls. New blood, old names, and no interest in becoming Roman. The next shift wouldn't come from the sea. It would come from the forests, from the mist, from the north, the Lombards, the Goths, the Franks. To the Romans, they were barbarians, wild, uncivilized, foreign. But history has a strange way of folding, because the DNA of those northern tribes, the very ones who burned Rome's libraries and tore down its walls, didn't disappear after the fires. It stayed. It settled. It mixed. In northern Italy, their mark is still written in blood. Haplogroups like I1, R1A, fingerprints of the far north, still flow in cities like Bergamo and Aosta. These weren't just raiders. They became rulers. Lombard kings in Italian courts. Gothic nobles carving out the future of the fractured peninsula. What started as an invasion became an inheritance. And the strangest part? They lived inside the ruins. Germanic blood, sleeping beneath Roman arches. Foreign lineages born into Italian futures. A child raised in Milan might trace his ancestry not to Julius Caesar, but to a warrior who once stormed his temple. And that's the twist history rarely tells. These outsiders weren't erased. They were absorbed, even welcomed. The invaders didn't just take the land. They became part of the name. And slowly, their cold northern fire blended with the southern warmth, forming a new version of Italian. Not Latin, not Gothic, something hybrid, something unspoken. But while the North was rebuilding from ruin, the South was being rebuilt by something else entirely. Not by war, but by wind. Across the sea, another empire was rising, and it didn't come from the forests. It came from the desert. While the North was rebuilding from ruins, brick by brick, name by name, the South was listening to a different rhythm. A rhythm carried not by forests, but by wind. Not by swords, but by sails. From across the blue edge of the Mediterranean, they came, Berbers, Arabs, desert traders, and scholars, riding waves instead of war. Sicily didn't fall. It opened. And in that opening, something extraordinary happened. Mosques rose beside Roman ruins. Citrus trees took root where vineyards once grew. And for 2 centuries, the island became a mirror of North Africa. But what the eye could see, irrigation canals, Arabic inscriptions, domed towers, was only half the story. The rest went deeper, into the blood. Today, Sicilian DNA still carries it, the signature of a forgotten empire. 6 to 7% of Y-DNA, traced directly to North Africa. Haplogroups like EM81 and J1, not scattered across Italy, but concentrated tightly, almost solely in the south. Palermo, Agrigento, the deep folds of Calabria. And it sparks a question most never ask. What does it mean to have Roman citizenship, but Saharan roots? To speak Italian, but carry the genes of men who prayed facing Mecca? Is it contradiction? Or is it the core of Italian identity itself? Because Sicily didn't just survive the invasion. It merged with it. It fed it, named it, breathed it in until it became unshakable. Arabic words still hide in Sicilian dialects. Lemon groves still bloom from Berber irrigation lines. The streets, once Ottoman, then Norman, now Italian, all sit layered on the same bones. But this isn't just the story of empire. It's the story of fusion. And even fusion leaves shadows. Because if you look past the mosques and cathedrals, past the conquerors and kings, you'll find something else. People with no flag, no written past, no recorded history. And yet, the DNA still speaks. Quietly. From the hills, from the mountains, from the forgotten places, past the cathedrals, past the conquerors, past the desert winds. There were others. They didn't build empires. They built silence. You won't find them in textbooks, or marble statues, or empire scrolls. But their whispers live inside your DNA. Because in the folds of Italy, behind the mountains, deep in the rural hills, tucked into forgotten villages, are stories no one ever taught you. The Daunians of Apulia, Illyrians, not Romans. Their blood still speaks beneath olive trees. In Aosta, near the snowline, French signatures linger in the bones, from settlers who never left. And scattered across Calabria and Sicily, the Arborish, Albanian by tongue, Italian by paper, and genetically neither. They came centuries ago, fleeing war, and stayed like echoes sealed in stone. No assimilation, no forgetting. Even now, they marry within, keep their vowels sharp, keep their genome distinct. And that's the secret Italy never says aloud. Its identity was never clean, never singular. It was always a braid, wound tight, thread by thread. Not erased history, but layered memory. And in that braid, the forgotten still live. Surnames that don't match the dialect. Skin tones that drift a shade too far from the region. Eyes that speak a language older than the map. You are not just one story. You are thousands, some told, some hidden, some still waking. Because every time your blood moves, it remembers. It remembers the ones who survived, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who never got a statue, but left something stronger, something no war could erase. And the most haunting part? This story isn't over, because your ancestors didn't just leave you a name. They left you a map, and that map, stitched into your blood, coiled deep in your cells, has one more secret. It doesn't just tell you where you came from. It tells you what's coming. Because your genome isn't just memory. It's motion. Scientists are beginning to read it. Not like a history book, but like a prophecy. And what they're finding is staggering. In the north, adaptations tied to cold, famine, fat metabolism, echoes of survival under glaciers, still pulsing in modern metabolisms. In the south, DNA that speaks sun, melanin regulators, skin protection pathways, inherited not by choice, but by centuries beneath Mediterranean heat. Even now, your body carries the armor of your ancestors, armor built by geography, by climate, by war, by love. And today, that ancient code is being read by machines. Precision medicine, genetic diagnostics, they're mapping your future using fragments from 8,000 years ago. One test, one scan, one gene. And suddenly, the choices of Neolithic farmers or desert traders begin echoing in your own life. Not in myth. In medicine, this isn't ancestry for curiosity. It's for survival. Because every trait you carry, every tolerance, every risk, is a footnote from 1,000 migrations. And that's the twist. You are not a finished story. You are still being written by people long gone. Their storms are still shaping your bones. Their fears still whisper in your immune system. Their migrations still steer your blood through modern cities. You are the archive of every step they took, every border they crossed, every love they lost, and every adaptation they earned so you could live. But what happens when the story you've always believed doesn't match the DNA?